Morgan's Terrific Talking Dog. Written and illustrated by Stephanie Lopez. Dedicated to Rosemary, Valerie, Eduardo, Mom, and Dad. Introducing Mary, the talking dog, Morgan, the owner, Mr. and Mrs. Ruby, and the evil scientist. I'm going shopping, Mrs. Ruby told her daughter Morgan. Grandma Georgina is going to take care of you while I'm gone. I'll wait until she gets here, okay? Mama, it's been almost an hour, said Morgan. Grandma's house is only 10 minutes away. I know, but there's a lot of traffic in Washington, D.C., Morgan, replied Mrs. Ruby. Ring. Just then, Mrs. Ruby's phone rang. She picked it up and looked at the screen. The call was coming from a hospital number. She answered the phone. Hello, said Mrs. Ruby. Hello, is this the daughter of Georgina Ruby? Asked the hospital. Yes, this is she, answered Mrs. Ruby. I'm sorry, but I have very hard news to share. Your mother passed away earlier today. She was involved in a car accident on her way to your house. She told us this in her final moments, said the person from the hospital. Thank you for letting me know, said Mrs. Ruby, beginning to cry. Mrs. Ruby didn't go shopping. Instead, she told Morgan to go to her room because she didn't want her to see her crying. Mrs. Ruby cried and didn't stop. She waited for Mr. Ruby to come home from work to tell him the bad news. As soon as he stepped inside the house, he saw his wife on the couch crying. Why are you crying? Asked Mr. Ruby. My mother passed away today. She was in a car accident, answered Mrs. Ruby, and I don't know how to tell Morgan. They were really close. We should tell her tonight, said Mrs. Ruby. Dinner time, yelled Mrs. Ruby. Morgan went downstairs to the kitchen and sat down between Mr. and Mrs. Ruby. What are we having tonight? Asked Morgan. Nanum, answered Mrs. Ruby, who was getting out the plates to eat. What's that? Asked Morgan. It's egg, ham, and sausage mixed together, answered Mrs. Ruby. It's your grandmother's favorite. Everybody was quiet. Morgan was eating, but Mrs. Ruby wasn't. She just moved her fork around the plate. Morgan got up and put her plate in the sink, opened a cabinet, and grabbed some gum. Do you want some? Asked Morgan, smiling. Yes, actually, answered Mrs. Ruby. Mrs. Ruby grabbed a piece. Ow, it shook me, said Mrs. Ruby. Sorry, it was a trick, said Morgan. Sit down. I have some sad news to share with you, Morgan. Your grandmother passed away this morning, said Mrs. Ruby. Morgan started crying. The day after the funeral, Mr. Ruby came home with a dog to make Morgan feel better. A dog, yelled Morgan. A golden retriever. What are you going to name her? Asked Mr. Ruby. Mary, answered Morgan. One day, not long after that, Morgan was running with Mary. They were running all over the park. Morgan stopped to take a drink of water. Morgan decided to go home because it was getting cold. In fact, it looked like it was going to rain, so the two of them raced home. Morgan stopped running and opened the door. Mary went into the kitchen. I'm home, yelled Morgan. Nobody answered. Morgan went to the kitchen and gave Mary some water and a treat. Morgan saw a note on the table. It said, I'm at work and so is your dad. We will be home around 5:30. Love, Mom. You see, Mary, Mama thinks that work is more important than her daughter, said Morgan. This is what she wrote. I am at work and so is your father. We will be home around 5:30. Okay, but you don't have to complain so much about it, said Mary, talking like a little furry human being. Okay, you're right. It's not like they only go to work. They do get up and make breakfast before they leave. This happens every day. Did you just talk? Dogs definitely don't talk, said Morgan. Yes, I talked. How do you do that? Asked Morgan. I learned from my parents. Please don't tell anyone. Scientists wanted to get rich and famous, so they made us into talking dogs. They got my parents off the street and made a potion for them. They didn't give up until they got my parents to talk, said Mary. And please don't tell your parents because they will take me away from you. Am I the first person you talked to? Asked Morgan. No, answered Mary. I also talked to the people who gave my parents the power to talk. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Ruby went into the kitchen to make Nana. Good morning, said Mrs. Ruby. They weren't the only ones downstairs. Mary was also there. Mary heard someone say good morning and thought it was Morgan, so she responded, Good morning, Morgan. Mrs. Ruby looked at Mr. Ruby. They both looked to see who said good morning. Then they saw that was just Mary. Ah! Screamed Mr. and Mrs. Ruby. This woke up Morgan, and she went to see who was screaming. She saw Mary and told her to go upstairs. Morgan, Mother, Father, please don't tell anyone about this, said Morgan. Forget this ever happened. Please, just go to work. Did you know about this, Morgan? Asked Mr. Ruby. Yes, answered Morgan. I didn't want to tell you guys because I was afraid that if you guys knew, you would send her back to the animal shelter. We would never do that, said Mrs. Ruby. We have to go to work now, honey, said Mr. Ruby. The two parents left the house, got into their car, and drove away and drove to work together. They got to work and put on their white lab coats. They went to their lab partners to work on potions. Mrs. Ruby couldn't keep a secret because she has a big mouth. Could I tell you something? Asked Mrs. Ruby. Her partner's head nodded. My daughter has a talking golden retriever, said Mrs. Ruby. Mrs. Ruby partner went over to her former partner and told him what Mrs. Ruby had just told her. They immediately made a plan to steal the dog. They put on their black suits and got a big bag. They got in their car and drove all the way to Morgan's house. They knew the way because they had dinner with her family before. When they got there, they got out of the car and went to Morgan's open window. They swung a rope into Morgan's room and climbed it and looked for Mary with a flashlight. They finally found her and put her in the black bag. They got in their car and drove away. Morgan didn't realize that they had stolen Mary because she was sleeping the whole time. In the morning, Morgan woke up and went to see Mary, but she wasn't there. So she yelled, Mama! Father! Mr. and Mrs. Ruby got out of bed and ran to Morgan's room. What is it? Asked Mr. Ruby. Mary is missing. Did you tell somebody? It was me, said Mrs. Ruby. I told my lab partner. Morgan grabbed her iPhone 6 Plus and dialed 911. She told the police what happened. The police went to the scientist's home lab, but they weren't there. Still, Mary was. They took Mary back to Morgan and kept on looking for the scientist. The police went to the lab where everyone worked. and found them holding a potion. Drop that and put your hands where I could see them, commanded the police officers. One of the scientists snapped their fingers and they both disappeared into thin air. The police looked everywhere and couldn't find them. On the other hand, Morgan and Mary were happy. That was a good story, said Mary. Have your parents read it yet? No, said Morgan, smiling.